The first ever NBA All-Star Game was played on March 2nd, 1951. Since that time, 454 players have had their name called in the game. Thousands of other NBA players have never played in the game.
One of the greatest accomplishments for any NBA player is to make the All-Star Game. Every year, players from all across the country come together in a recognition of talent and achievement. What about the players who don't quite make it?
In today's episode of Once Upon a Dribble, Josh and Calvin go over 4 of the most baffling All-Star Game snubs. Players who had great careers, but for one reason or another, never received the All-Star call. We dive deep into the lives and times of some of the finest players of the game who never had their greatness properly recognized. This is Once Upon a Dribble.
And we are back at it again. Josh, how we doing today?
We're doing good. Ready to get back into the NBA time machine after an episode of not being too far back in NBA history. We're gonna, jump around to a couple different spots. So yeah, excited to hop back into it.
Yeah, and really an interesting topic here, because the All-Star Game, it's decided principally by fan voting. And then you have the reserves, which are decided by coaches. You have injury replacements.
Mm-hmm.
And it used to be, when there were 8 teams in the league, 12 teams in the league, it was fairly easy to make the game, right? These days, a lot of really good players get snubbed almost every year.
Yeah, I was gonna say that's the word, snub. It seems like every year nowadays you have some sort of ESPN article, whether it's Zach Lowe's a name attached to it or someone else, to have almost a full article focused on just the snubs as well as the guys who actually make the team. And that's just how things are nowadays. Like you said, it was different back then. It was different to not see those sorts of things pop up as frequently. But yeah, nowadays, a lot of good names get left off, and there's just a lot of talent.
A lot of names get left off, and occasionally a name gets included that kind of makes you say, wait, what? We may cover that a little bit. We're going to also cover some of the most predominant players who never made the game. And as we were going through this and doing our research for this episode, there was quite a few surprising names to choose from. We're going to highlight just a few. Josh, do you want to get us kicked off?
Yeah, let's go ahead and get this show on the road. We have a few really fun names here, and we want you guys to think as we're kind of laying out the case for these players, if you think that they deserve to have their name called on All-Star Weekend. So, first guy I have lined up for you is known as one of the greatest dunkers of all time, also for being a dead-eye shooter. But what is surprising to many is, as with the theme, never made an All-Star team, and that is Jason Richardson. Richardson, he enjoyed a solid career at MSU. Cool to see. He was a Michigan native, so he had an illustrious 2-year college career as a Spartan, played alongside other future NBA players like Zach Randolph and Charlie Bell. And the 6'6", 220 shooting guard, small forward combo declares for the 2001 draft. He's selected 5th overall in what is a really, really good draft in retrospect. We've talked about the 2000 draft before on one of our very first episodes, actually. That's notorious for being one of the worst drafts of all time. But the 2001 draft is a far cry from that. It's got 8 future All-Stars. It's got Gilbert Arenas, Tyson Chandler, Pau Gasol, Joe Johnson, Tony Parker, Gerald Wallace, and another name we might see a little bit later, Mehmet Okur, as well as Jay Rich's college teammate Zach Randolph. And Jay Rich doesn't make that list as we now know, but he's amongst these awesome names here, and he's drafted to a Warriors team that is a far cry from the teams of the 2010s. So if you're a lifelong Warriors fan or a fan who is just a true scholar of their history, then these were dark days for the Warriors. So they get the 5th pick in 2001 because they won 17 games that year. For those counting at home, 17 wins is not good in an 82 game regular season. So, Jay Rich drops into a team with a 25-year-old Antoine Jameson. They got Danny Fortson. They got a young Larry Hughes. They got a young Eric Dampier. They even have a 20-year-old Gilbert Arenas, again, who's in the same draft class. So, you may recognize some of the names here, but this is a very young, very raw team. And Richardson jumps into the NBA, submits a really good rookie campaign, plays in 80 games, 75 as a starter, averages a hair over 14 points per game. And as expected for what looks to be a solid rookie campaign, he's voted to the 2002 All-Rookie First Team. He's third in Rookie of the Year voting. And, he's dynamic and flashy immediately from the time that he enters the league. And I'm sure for what, of course, you remember him for, as well as, many others, is he's one of the darlings of the slam dunk contest in the early 2000s. And this was, you can tell me what you think on this, but I think this was arguably when the contest was at its peak, early 2000s to mid 2000s kind of time.
The golden age of the contest, when it was really transitioning from pretty bland dunks into very cinematic dunks is a way to put it.
Yeah, I think that's the best way to put it. It truly became a showcase during this era. Obviously, it's spearheaded by Vince Carter, who you could argue is most synonymous with the contest. But Jason Richardson was right there because he had arguably the best run in the contest, as he goes back-to-back in 2002 and 2003, nearly three-peats in 2004, where he fell to Fred Jones of the Pacers in the finals, and not a name that you hear too often outside of the slam dunk contest. But for Jason, who grew up idolizing Dominique Wilkins, again, wins the 0-2 crown with a bounce catch and reverse windmill jam, 0-3 title with a bounce catch in between the legs over the head flush, and then he misses his final attempt in 2004, and it was a dunk that would have likely locked up the three-peat, but it took him a couple of tries. But, back to his playing career, Jason was getting better individually each year. His scoring jumps from 14 to nearly 16 in year 2, up to 19 in year 3. And then in 2005, he starts to get votes for most improved player. He averages 21.7 points per game, 5.9 rebounds. And this is the year where he truly begins to endear himself to the Bay Area faithful, because I must note that he is one of the more beloved players in franchise history, not only for that electric play style, but for his real dedication to the team, the fan base, and for his maturity, especially in an age where a lot of these young players, we talked about this before, show a degree of knuckleheadedness, whether they're jumping right from high school to the league or just very, very raw emotionally or have a very eccentric personality. During this age in the late 90s, early 2000s, Jason Richardson definitely appears to be an enigma compared to a lot of his contemporaries. So now this brings us to one of his two greatest individual seasons in which I think he has the strongest case for All-Star. In 2006, he averages a career-high 23.2 points per game, 5.8 rebounds. But what is striking is his marked improvement in his three-point shot, something that would permanently be in his arsenal for the rest of his career. So in 2006, he takes more than 6 threes per game, 6.4 to be in fact. And I'm sure, as you might guess, in the mid-2000s, taking 6 threes per game is like taking 10 to 12 threes per game in today's league. And as you might guess, 6.4 in 2006 is fourth in the league in attempts, and he makes 38% of them. So it's bombs away in 2006 if you're taking that many, but he's making a good amount of them. And although he's great, we all know how deep the West is in the 2000s. So even though he's great, the other guards and wings to make the All-Star team in 2006 are Ray Allen, Kobe Bryant, Tracy McGrady, Steve Nash, Tony Parker. So unfortunately, Jason Richardson, despite a career year, can't break the roster with those other names vying for places. So despite the improvement from him individually, as far as the team goes, the Warriors also missed the playoffs again. And this is the 12th straight year that as a franchise, they've missed the playoffs. Remember, this is a Warriors franchise that isn't winning and hasn't seen a lot of winning in a long time. And one thing that was really cool as I was doing my research, after that 2006 season for Jay Rich, the Warriors don't make the playoffs. So Richardson issues an apology during the home finale and apologizes to the fans for not rewarding their devotion and record-breaking attendance season with a playoff spot. And according to team officials, he split the nearly $100,000 cost of full-page ads to run that same apology that he issued in-game to put into Bay Area newspapers that said the exact same thing.
Wow.
Really cool gesture, I thought that was really cool. So, how does he repay them? Well, he helps Golden State reach the playoffs in 2007. As we all know, they upset the Mavericks in round one, the 67-win Mavs, that iconic we believe team before they fall to Calvin's Jazz in the second round. And he did it in the most unselfish way possible. I just talked about this breakout 2006 season, and any chance of him continuing to improve in 2007 at just age 26, when he should be hitting his prime, took an immediate backseat to team success. Richardson welcomes Baron Davis to the Warriors roster without worrying about being displaced as the leading man on the team. And all he would do is just give credit to Baron, to Steven Jackson, and some of the other guys. So despite Baron Davis taking over as the face of that iconic Golden State team, Warriors fans knew that it was Richardson who paved the way, as so many other flashy youngsters played in the Bay Area during this playoff drought, like Latrell Sprewell, Antoine Jameson, Gilbert Arenas, but it was Jason Richardson who stuck with the team. And sadly, right after that, this is when his time as a Warrior comes to an end. He's traded to Charlotte that summer for the draft rights to drumroll Brandon Wright. I don't know if you remember Brandon Wright.
That's a deep dive. Wow,
that's a deep one. Yeah. And there's a reason he's a deep dive name, because he didn't pan out too well. So, by dumping his salary, they freed up some money to make some free agency moves. But fans and teammates alike mourned his departure, especially considering Jay Rich lashed out at the Warriors front office and Chris Mullin, sounding especially angry and disillusioned, as he supposedly was told that he wasn't going to be trade bait, only to be traded. But by the time his Bobcat conference call rolled around, he was back to himself, the guy that Warriors fans would miss, the anti-NBA head case. He acknowledges that he was hurt, but said it's a business, said he was grateful for his contract, his health, and that he's still ultimately on an NBA team, so what else could he ask for? And then in 2008, he submits, what arguably is his second best season to be in the NBA All-Star game. As a Bobcat, he joins Gerald Wallace, Raymond Felton, Emeka Okafor, and a hodgepodge of no-names in Charlotte. Age 27, plays all 82 games, averages 22 points per game, shoots 41% from three on over 7 attempts, arguably one of the 5 to 7 or so best shooters in the entire league that year. All of this as the team's bona fide number one option. And the Bobcats only win 32 games that year. Again, the roster isn't great, to no fault of Jason Richardson's. And he actually had comparable statistical campaigns to some of the other lower-end East All-Stars like Caron Butler, Chauncey Billups, Antoine Jameson, but it appears that it ultimately boiled down to team success, although I believe, personally, that Jason Richardson certainly had a case to at least sneak in as a low-end All-Star in 2008. And this really thus ends the last good shot at him being named an All-Star. But what makes his career so admirable is how he seamlessly transitioned from being a number one option on some not very good Warrior and Bobcat teams to a high-level starter / role player and fantastic sniper on some very good Suns and Magic teams. He was moved to Phoenix early in the 08-09 season, played 32 minutes per game for a 2010 Suns team that nearly made the finals, and then moved to Orlando for the last couple Dwight Howard seasons. He eventually retires after the 2015 season and a brief stint with the Sixers, and thus concludes the career of one of the greatest players to never make an All-Star team, Jason Richardson.
Very good choice. And, one of those undercover guys who, you say the name Jason Richardson, all NBA guys know who he is, but he's just not someone that comes up a whole lot in conversations, and he should. He was just such a good player for those really bad Golden State teams.
Definitely.
And, going from a guy like Jason Richardson, who's synonymous with one franchise, despite the fact that he played for a few, I'm going to actually shift it to a guy who's known for playing for many, many teams. Jamal Crawford. Okay? One of the greatest six-man, probably in my opinion, the greatest six-man to ever play in the game. The Seattle native was drafted in 2000, which has Josh mentioned and has me mentioned in one of our earliest episodes of Once Upon a Dribble. The 2000 draft class was not a good draft class. But there were some exceptions, Jamal Crawford actually being probably the brightest exception, in my opinion. And he would actually be the last man standing in that draft class. A 20-year-plus NBA career. And despite, again, 3 Six-Man of the Year trophies in his trophy case, never did suit up during All-Star Weekend. Let's take a look at why that may have been. So the legend of Jamal Crawford, Josh, actually goes all the way back to when he was in high school in the 90s. The Seattle Supersonics have some kind of event where they invite the local high school stars to an open gym with the team. 16-year-old Crawford busts out a crossover so nasty on 3-time All-Star Detlef Schrempf, the original Nowitzki, the original German. The 16-year-old's crossover was so nasty that staff actually thought that Detlef had been injured because he fell down. That's where it begins. He's a top 50 recruit, really underrated as a recruit. But he ends up signing with Michigan because of his admiration of the legendary Fab Five. Crawford would say, "I think Michigan had me before they even knew it. I wanted to go there for so long, and once I took my visit there, on my visit, they promised me Jalen Rose's locker. It was a done deal." So, you think about those Michigan teams of the early 90s, those UNLV teams of the early 90s, they kind of shaped how basketball was viewed. Well, Crawford has a pretty good collegiate career, albeit only 1 year, 17 points, 5 assists, 3 rebounds. Catapults him up NBA draft boards where he's actually selected by Cleveland, only to be traded on draft night to Chicago for the man, the myth, and the legend, Chris Mihm.
Oh man, there's another one of those names.
It is one of those names, and probably would say Chicago won that trade, except it wasn't very long-standing, because being traded would actually prove to become an all too familiar motif in Crawford's career, in which he would suit up for 9 NBA teams and play for 19 coaches in 20 years of playing.
Jeez.
But, I mean, in every location, his job on the court was always to do pretty much the same thing. As noted in a 2017 feature from Sports Illustrated, he was expected to do what he's always done: get irrationally hot, irrationally fast. And that is what Jamal Crawford does. So, some of his most remarkable accomplishments, and those many to talk about, just kind of pull a few. He becomes the oldest player in NBA history to score 50 points in a game. That's an accomplishment that he would notch at age 39. And he did so quite fittingly, coming off the bench, shooting 18 for 30 from the field, 7 of 12 from 3, 8 of 9 from the line. And Josh, by the way, this would prove to be his second to last NBA game. He retires as the NBA's all-time leader in 4-point plays, a record that has since been eclipsed by both James Harden and Steph Curry, understandably, but still an amazing accomplishment at the time. And he is the only NBA player to be record 50-point games with 4 different franchises. He got the big 5-0 with Chicago, Golden State, the Knicks, and finally the Phoenix Suns. He finishes his career second all-time in NBA points off the bench to Lou Williams, a player he's often compared to. But being a flamethrower off the bench wasn't always in Crawford's plans. He would even say himself, reflecting on his career, no one goes up wanting to be a 6-man. That wasn't part of the deal. But one thing Crawford did know about was putting a basketball into the hoop. And whatever role that could best facilitate that, Crawford eventually would come around to the idea. And Josh, one anonymous NBA GM kind of put it in very, very good way. He said, "Everyone knows one of the worst things to happen to you is to let that guy make 2 shots in a row. Because then, soon it's 5, 6, on and on. That was exemplified. I want to put one example. That was exemplified no better than a game on January 26, 2007 at Madison Square Garden, where Crawford was playing for the Knicks at the time. This is a game where he's actually starting, kind of semi-unusual for him. He begins the game missing 4 shots in a row. He finally gets his first basket at the 1:28 mark of the first quarter. Gets it on a 3 off an assist from Stephon Marbury. Well, after he finally gets that basket to fall, he makes his next shot. Then his next shot. Then his next shot. By halftime, he had made 8 straight field goals, and he already had 23 points. He comes out in the second half. He makes his first shot. He makes his next shot. He makes his next shot. He makes his first 8 attempts out of the locker room. So do the math.
Wow.
8 attempts to end the first half. 8 attempts to begin the second half. 16 straight made field goals.
Wow.
This was on his way to 52 points. I mean, talk about being in the zone, right? Crawford himself would say, it felt like I could kick it up there and it would go in. Like, it doesn't matter where you are on the court. It doesn't matter who's there. You're just like, I'm in range. And let it go. And boom, it's gone. Just remarkable ability to put the ball in the basket. And when it was all said and done, Crawford ended his career with 19,519 points, of which 11,280 came off the bench. As mentioned, that's second only all-time to Lou Williams. But despite as impressive as those numbers are, Josh, there's another big number from his career, and that's the number 5. You know what that number means? Take a guess.
5. Oh, man. It's not I couldn't guess it. Let's hear it. No, his number is, it's not his 50-point games, is it?
It's not his 50-point games. Number 5 is the amount of times Crawford was traded, including the deal on draft night.
Oh, yeah, you teased that. That's right, yeah.
So, perhaps, unfortunately, Crawford was too unique. Sports Illustrated noted in that same 2017 article that the 6'5" Crawford still doesn't play like anybody else. Nor does anybody really play like him. He skips as much as he runs. His dribble is nearly chest height, where coaches teach you not to keep it. When he crosses over, he does so precipitously that with devastating speed that from afar he appears to be all limbs upon which a giant round head bobs. And then again, the same anonymous GM said, not my type of player. He overhandles too much one-on-one. So, Josh, you could say sometimes our greatest strengths can also be our greatest weaknesses. So, consequently, Crawford often found himself on teams looking to rebuild as opposed to teams looking to contend. In fact, after entering the league at age 20, he does not see playoff basketball until age 29. Nearly a decade. For various teams, mind you, almost always on the outside looking in. In fact, in 20 seasons in the NBA, only 8 extended beyond the regular season, and none of them moved past the second round. So if you ask me, that's probably why he never gets that All-Star recognition, because he's just never on, or almost never on, particularly good teams. In fact, Jamal Crawford has a career winning percentage of just 36%.
Oof, yeah, that'll do it.
Is that the reason he never makes the game? It's possible. But one thing's for sure, when it comes to just watching unbelievable pure scoring, there has never been a better ticket than Jamal Crawford, and I would stand by that.
This is a great pick for this because I think that he is like you said, it's just one of those names that growing up I feel like if there is some sort of flashy highlight on top 10 because of his handle or some acrobatic finish at the rim or some explosive scoring performance, it was a good chance that his name was attached to that highlight package. And I'm glad you said he played for 9. I was trying to remember how many teams he had played for before you said it, because I knew there was a lot. Because I was like, in my head, I'm like, oh, he's on the Knicks. Oh yeah, he's on the Hawks too. Oh yeah, that's right. He played in Golden State for half a season. Oh yeah, of course he's a Clipper. So I was like, oh, maybe 6 or 7, and then nope, 9. And then I'm looking at his Basketball Reference, and he even snuck in one more game with the Brooklyn Nets before
that counts.
Before it counts before calling it quits. So. Yeah, great pick here with Jamal Crawford. And the next guy that I want to touch on is actually almost a complete contrast in style and electricity to Jamal Crawford, but arguably just as statistically potent and maybe just as chronically stuck on bad teams as Jamal Crawford was. And that's someone who is affectionately known as Big Al Jefferson. And he's one of my favorite players, one that actually holds a soft spot, I'm sure, in both of our hearts, as he played in both Utah and Boston. And if you look at Big Al's stats, you may ask how he never made an All-Star team. He had a 7-year peak from 2008 to 2014, where I guarantee that any of you out there saw his name countless times on the crawl at the bottom of the big screen on ESPN, registering his standard nightly 20 points and 10 rebounds. And during that peak, for over 500 regular season games, he was just that. He was a 20-point, 10-rebound guy and did so on solid efficiency. But what plagues him plagues so many of these players who just barely missed the All-Star team, and it's that he was ultimately a good stats, bad team guy.
Mm-hmm.
Al Jefferson only has 21 playoff games to his name. And 7 of those came when he was a rookie in Boston and was playing less than 20 minutes per night.
Oof.
And if you go back and look at Jefferson's career, he played for a Celtics team pre-Big Three when they lost 18 straight, most notably in the 2006-2007 season. The Timberwolves, when they plowed through 3 coaches in 3 years. And then the Jazz during the Jerry Sloan, Darren Williams divorce. And in his 2019 book, Sprawl Ball, Kirk Goldsberry uses Al Jefferson as his metaphor for the NBA dinosaur, a player who has been legislated from relevance by rules and trends, maximizing the three-pointer and minimizing the post resident. And the evidence is compelling. It is true that there are relatively few players in the league today that are most at home operating on the block. And it's fitting that aside from Big Al, Basketball Reference has Big Classic listed as one of his nicknames.
Ooh, I like that.
That's a good one, right? I mean, Basketball Reference pulls these out, and sometimes I got to fact check them, but Big Classic indeed, I think, is very apt for Al Jefferson here.
So appropriate. Absolutely. Great nickname.
And what this recognition of the current basketball climate ignores is that for years, Jefferson was post-royalty, destroying defenders who tried to stop him from scoring down low. He hit just 8 total three-pointers across 915 career games, so I can't even make the argument that if he were drafted, 5 to 10 years later, that he would have been a good stretch big. There's nothing to really indicate that, unfortunately. Instead, he thrived down low with an array of pivots, backdowns, and deft touch around the rim. And he was regarded as one of the toughest covers in the league, despite never stretching the floor like a Kevin Love or destroying the rim like a Blake Griffin. Now, yes, he was not a good defensive center, at all, and that very much possibly hurt his case for an All-Star, but he was so good offensively at his peak that I think it warranted at least 1 or 2 low-end All-Star appearances. So I want to take a quick look at some of his best seasons and see why he's one of the more unique cases in this never star conversation. So Big Al's reared by his mother and 14 relatives in Prentiss, Mississippi, and he was a big kid. By age 10, they're already calling him Big Al. And at a young age, he was recruited to join a real AAU team, and people would crowd gyms at Prentiss High to see him play. One of the funnier stories is Jerry West, the logo himself, shows up one day, and Big Al cooks up 62 points, 21 rebounds,
and 11 blocks, just towering over his contemporaries. Again, he's a big kid. And he's looking over at the logo the whole time to see his reaction, just to learn after the game that he was checking out the wrong middle-aged white guy.
Oh, no.
But, suffice to say that Jerry West was impressed with his performance. And he actually forgoes college. He's drafted right to the league from high school to Boston in the 2004 draft, 15th overall. And he doesn't break into a starting role actually until 2007 when he hires a personal chef. He drops 30 pounds. He shifts from power forward to center, and he basically doubles his minutes per game. He averages a 16 and 11 as a 22-year-old and lands on some most improved player ballots. And, while that looks good for him, that increase in value, however, was just enough for old Danny Ainge to dangle him in a trade that ultimately netted Boston Kevin Garnett in that infamous, 7 or 8 player for 1 player deal. So a rising Al Jefferson at just 23 years old is sent to the dregs of the West as a Timberwolf. And it continues to get better. He's 4th in most improved player voting in 2008, averages 21 and 11. And then in 2009, he averages a career-nigh 23.1 points to go along with 11 more rebounds. 23 and 11, that's a fantastic season. He's
excellent season.
And the thing is, he's relatively healthy at his peak, too. He doesn't miss a whole lot of games. Usually frequently playing in the 70s to low 80s. And 2009 is the first season where I think he arguably could have been an all-star, especially considering how he averaged 27 and 12 in the 11 games leading into the all-star break. Although, voting is usually wrapped up by then. And not only that, unfortunately, he was on a Minnesota team that won 24 games, and the second leading scorer was, take a guess, Randy Foye.
Not a good
Randy
indication that that's a good team.
Yeah, I was going to say, no, when it's him and then the drop off to your second highest scorer is Randy Foye, that's, not a good sign. And he'd only have to endure one more season in Minnesota before he's traded to a Jazz team that before the 2010-11 season was sort of in the midst of retooling from their recent run of late 2000s, mid-2000s playoff team success. And Al Jefferson gets to Utah, and Darren Williams tells him, I'm going to make you an all-star. Something very promising to hear, as Darren Williams, as we all know, at that time was frequently in best point guard in the world talks alongside Chris Paul. I remember as a kid in middle school and early high school having those Darren Williams versus Chris Paul debates at lunchtime, especially growing up in Utah. But sadly, Darren had drained the last bit of patience from Jerry Sloan, who retires. Utah moves on from Darren Williams, and then the unholy rule of Ty Corbin was in Utah as they start to retool around Al Jefferson, Paul Millsap, and a rising 21-year-old Gordon Hayward. I'm sure you're very familiar with the old Ty Corbin reign in Utah.
Yeah, it was a dark time to be a Jazz fan.
It was, and like I said, especially after that time in the late 2000s where the Jazz were playoff contenders year in and year out. And I'll say this, much to Al's credit, the team retools relatively quickly. 2012 is Al's next best shot at being an all-star. This is the lockout-shortened season, and in a super competitive Western Conference, Al is Utah's leading scorer, and he steadies them to a 36-30 record, which translates to about 45 wins in a full 82-game season, and they're back in the playoffs after they missed out in 2011. He shows energy and tenacity as well as an improved focus on his defensive game, although, again, he's never a strong positive on that end of the floor. And heading into the All-Star break, many were calling for him to be selected to his first All-Star team, including Brian Smith of the Salt Lake Tribune, who says, if the Jazz keep winning during January and Jefferson keeps producing, then the 8-year vet could finally be in the running for an All-Star spot. And though Utah would fall to a vastly superior Spurs team in a quick sweep in the first round, Big Al in his first real playoff action as a starter, as a number one option, averaged 18 and 8 on 53% shooting against Tim Duncan, one of the top greatest players of all time, right when the Spurs were kind of hitting the second stage of their contention. And his leadership really flourished in Utah, where he groomed Derek Favors and the player formerly known as Enes Kanter to take his job told them and reassured them that he'd be fine as long as there's a spot for him somewhere else in the league. So really kind of mentoring these young big men under his wing. And in 2013, the Jazz narrowly missed the playoffs. Al enters free agency as one of the more valued players on the market. Unfortunately, the Jazz can't afford him, as in July of 2013, he signs a 3-year, $40.5 million contract with the Bobcats. And he enters his age 29 season primed to put out one of the great lost big men seasons ever. And 2013-14 is his greatest year, but it's also a season in which he obviously doesn't make the All-Star team, but he's selected to the All-NBA third team.
That's unusual.
So I was looking at this on his... Yeah, that does not happen very often. One of the other instances I could see for this was actually Goran Dragic, who makes an All-NBA third team once, but it didn't make the All-Star team that year. But Al Jefferson, All-NBA third team, not an All-Star. So how does this happen? Despite the big contract with a new team, Al Jefferson's arrival in Charlotte was delayed by a right ankle sprain that caused him to miss the entire preseason and then 9 of the team's first 12 games. And it kind of takes him a while to work back into rhythm. And it's really January when he's finally healthy and ready to dominate. But at that point, voting, or at least everyone's opinions on players, as we all know, is essentially wrapped up by that point. On January 31st, he scores a career-high 40 points versus the Lakers and then would continue this high-level play by winning Eastern Conference Player of the Month, not the week, Player of the Month in March, averaging 25 and 11 while shooting 55% from the floor. And yes, he is doing this in a conference that also employs prime LeBron James. So from January 11th to the end of the year, 45 games, he averages 25 and 11, shoots 54% from the field, as he leads a really solid Bobcats team in scoring. They win 43 games. They have the 5th best defense in the league, and they make the playoffs for just the 2nd time in franchise history. And after Big Al scores 38 against Miami and 34 against those impressive Indiana defenses in successive games back in March, Pacers coach Frank Vogel railed against fellow coaches who had not made Jefferson an All-Star. As we all know, the coaches are the ones who chime in for the All-Star reserves. And Jefferson, again, age 29 here, walks into a Charlotte locker room like a prospective parent entering an orphanage. He felt the hungry eyes of his new teammates gazing up at him, starving for guidance. Big Al would say, "I don't talk much, but they really wanted to listen to me." So he advises power forward Josh McRoberts not to worry so much about officiating. He reminds a young Kemba Walker to watch his body language. He asks small forward Michael Kidd-Gilchrist why in the world he would drive 1-on-5, to which Kidd-Gilchrist invariably responds, "My fault, my bad, you're right." And after LeBron James scored his career-high 61 points against that Bobcats defense, Jefferson told Kidd-Gilchrist, who is LeBron's primary defender, "He didn't score 61 on you, he scored 61 on all of us."
I like that.
And then 2 days later, an emboldened Kidd-Gilchrist guarded Indiana's Paul George, who went 0 for 9 with 2 points. Bobcats forward Anthony Tolliver, another role player, said that Al had been as valuable as anybody in the league because of that. And Al even happily took criticism from Coach Steve Clifford about his defense and why he maybe hadn't seen as much winning in his career up to that point. And again, not a coincidence that 2014 is not only his greatest individual season, but it's arguably his most impactful to winning in this Charlotte, on this, again, pretty good Charlotte team. They're not playoff contenders, but they make the playoffs. They do fall to LeBron's Heat in round 1, but it's a great season for Al. And I think it's because of that kind of injury to start the year, and really coming on the second half of the year when voting had already wrapped up, including post All-Star break, when he's voted third team All-NBA in 2014. You also have some sort of weird, position regulations with the All-NBA teams, as we know. But heading into 2014-15, Charlotte sold the most new season ticket packages in the NBA, in the entire league, thanks to Al and Kemba, as well as Larry Johnson and Alonzo Mourning, who helped the league approve the name change from Bobcats to Hornets for that season. During a game 5 months later, Michael Jordan unveiled a logo with the familiar purple and teal colors, and fans would cry in their seats, as such was the bond between Charlotte and the Hornets.
But sadly, in his age 30 season, Al was starting to deal with injuries. 15, the Hornets take a step back, and then in 2016, the Hornets were very good. They won 48 games that year, actually, but they lose in 7 games to the Heat in the first round. And Al Jefferson only played in 47 games that year. After that, he'd play a couple of seasons as a pacer, as a role player, but again, never playing full seasons again. And we last see him in an NBA jersey in the 2018 season. He played in the Chinese Basketball Association in 2018 after that Pacer stint, but he officially retires from the NBA in 2019. When Doc Rivers was coach for the Clippers, of course, who was Al Jefferson's boss in Boston, he says, "You know how there are people in your life who just bring sunshine? Well, that's what Big Al does for the NBA. He's sunshine. He brings it wherever he goes." And I'll tell you, for those listening, if you travel back to 2014, the Bobcats were never on national TV. So for anyone pining for some of those old classic vintage 80s post moves, you had to get on League Pass, but there you could find Al Jefferson chipping away on that beloved left block, but just short of that NBA All-Star team.
Wow. Just an absolute stand-up guy. I mean, both of the players you've highlighted, Josh, Richardson and Jefferson, they sound like presidents, but they're NBA players. Both of them just stand-up guys. Very, very impressive. And it's with that I have kind of a heavy heart going into this next All-Star snub. Because also a very stand-up guy, very gregarious, very popular amongst everybody who he interacted with. And yet, someone who had a life of tragedy and carried demons with him that many people never even knew about. We're going to take it to the 1997 National High School Player of the Year out of Queens, New York, Mr. Lamar Odom. Some of his, accolades include 2 championships, a 6th Man of the Year award, but never an All-Star selection, and probably more famous for reasons outside of basketball, for some pretty tragic outcomes. But before we get to that, we got to take it to the beginning. We're talking mostly about basketball here. But before we can get to that, we have to understand that Odom's life was just fraught with tragedy, even from a young age. He loses his mother to cancer at just age 12. His mom's last words were advice to him were to be nice to everybody, which is something that Odom would take to heart for the rest of his life. Oftentimes incurring fines because he was late to the bus because he was signing autographs for fans because he didn't want to leave any fan empty-handed. He loses his mother at age 12, and at the time, his father, who had his own set of demons, was a heroin addict and unfit for custody. So Odom spends the remainder of his childhood and adolescence with his grandmother. And despite these challenges, he becomes a playground legend and a high school phenom. I mentioned he was Parade Magazine's National Player of the Year. For the youngins in listening, Parade Magazine used to be a magazine that was included in your Sunday newspaper. So it was in hundreds of newspapers across the country. He commits to go play for UNLV. Much like I mentioned, Jamar being enamored with the early 90s Michigan teams, Lamar Odom was enamored of the early 90s Running Rebels, of those UNLV teams. But once again, life has other plans, and those accusations of inconsistencies, possible cheating on his ACT. And he is dismissed from UNLV before ever playing a game. Well, he makes his way back to the East Coast, and relatively close to home, he enrolls at Rhode Island University under some very strict circumstances. He's kind of on thin ice. His patterns of concerning behavior basically has a coping mechanism for life tragedy could already be seen, even in college, as at times Odom would just vanish for multiple days to get away from it all. Evidently, he would check himself into a hotel, leave his cell phone at home, and just not talk to anybody for an entire weekend, a few days at a time. It even once got so bad that he vanished right before taking finals. His college coach had to personally meet with his professors to beg them to allow Odom to do makeup work. But despite all that, in his lone college season, he averages 18-9. Fantastic season. Not to mention 3.8 assists. And nothing was bigger than his buzzer-beating 3 in the conference championship game to send the Rams to the NCAA tournament. Hugely successful, but after declaring for the draft, he actually has second thoughts. He doesn't think he's ready for the NBA. He tries to come back to school, only to find out that because he signed with an agent, he has forfeited his college eligibility. Nobody told him that was a rule. But even if Odom didn't consider himself ready for the NBA, Josh, NBA scouts beg to differ. And he actually was selected fifth overall by the LA Clippers. Now, in that first season, all Lamar Odom would do would prove the scouts right. Okay? His very first NBA game, this is a week before he even turns 20 years old, he puts up 30 and 12. That was en route to a rookie season that saw him average 17 and 8. He narrowly loses out on the Rookie of the Year honors to his former AAU teammate and future NBA teammate, Elton Brand. Well, later in his career, Sports Illustrated would summarize Odom's impact on the game thusly. They would say, if you were going to build a basketball player in a lab, it might look like Lamar Odom. A broad-shouldered Stretch Armstrong. He's a point guard in a power forward's body. Long enough to anchor the post, but coordinated enough to lead the break. And indeed, that doesn't sound like another NBA legend, maybe a Magic Johnson. That was actually Odom's idol growing up. He liked the way that Magic would distribute. Moving someone like Michael would just, put the ball in the basket. So, despite a really good rookie season and a couple of good following seasons, Odom would actually twice violated the league's anti-drug policy in his final season there in the red and blue of the Clippers. It was for marijuana, which, today marijuana is viewed much differently than it was viewed in the late 90s, the early 2000s. By 2003, his last season with the Clippers, his grandmother, who, keep in mind, has been his mother since he was age 12, passes away. And on top of that, he has a wrist injury, limiting him to just 39 games. So, hit after hit after hit. You can tell that he's a man who just carries a lot, despite his happy demeanor, his happy-go-lucky personality, his $1 million smile. There's a lot of darkness that is going on behind the scenes. But 2003 would be a season of new beginnings for Lamar, as he was paired with a dynamic rookie named Dwayne Wade over in Miami. This is when Odom gets his first taste of playoff basketball, and something that you'll see kind of has a pattern for his career is that he elevates his game in the playoffs. He averages 17 and 8 over 2 series before Miami is eventually dispatched by the New Orleans Hornets. Miami does dispatch the New Orleans Hornets before finally being defeated by the 1-seed Indiana Pacers in 6 games. So everything's looking up, but Odom's stay in South Beach would not last long, however, as just a few weeks after the season, he found himself included in one of the most impactful trades in the century. Josh alluded to Jefferson being included in the KG trade. That's probably the most impactful trade. Number 2 is the trade that sends Shaquille O'Neal back to the Sunshine State and sends Odom back to the City of Angels. The only difference is now each guy is on a different team. Odom is with the Lakers. Shaq is with the Heat. And if there were any years in which you could say Lamar Odom should have been an All-Star, it's going to be these years with the Lakers alongside Kobe Bryant. Huge argument. Now, you look at his stats on NBA Reference, still good, not great, but you cannot overstate just how important Lamar Odom was to the success of that mini dynasty in LA. But before we get that, let's wind it back a little bit. Lamar's first season for the Lakers, he averages a respectable 15-10. That's a drop in individual production from Miami, but that's, to be expected when suddenly you're playing alongside a megastar like Kobe. He deals with injury issues, at this time a shoulder injury, and the Lakers actually missed the playoffs under Rudy Tomjanovich, who would actually turn in his resignation mid-season. This is actually a matter of conspiratorial conjecture that he was actually terminated, but they wanted to save face. So, think of an Urban Meyer situation. Puts his coaching on health issues, but there may be something else going on behind the scenes. Well, that opens the door in year 2 for the triumphant return of none other than Phil Jackson. And this is when the Lakers start to really make a charge towards the end of the season and with Phil Jackson, and as does Odom. As he ups his regular season averages of 15-7 all the way up to 19-11 in the playoffs. But it's often not, as the Lakers are bounced in 7 games to the Suns. Which leads us to year number 3 in LA for Lamar Odom. It's much the same results. It's a first-round exit to Phoenix, despite some superb playoff numbers from Odom. And really, that may be the reason why he never gets the All-Star nod, in my estimation, is he would always elevate his game in the playoffs or in the weeks leading up to the playoffs. But in the time leading up to the All-Star game, maybe less intense. Maybe he would show up out of shape. He was known to really enjoy the sweets, known to really enjoy potato chips, of all things. Things get really, really rough again in this year 3 for the Lakers. Lamar goes back to New York for another funeral. This time it's for his aunt. While in New York for the funeral, Odom encounters what, in my opinion, is the worst nightmare imaginable. I have a little baby. She's 1 year old. She had a lot of health issues for her first little while. Lamar Odom, while visiting New York for a funeral, his 6-month-old son passes away with SIDS. Sudden infant death syndrome. Which, for those who don't know, it's just a tragedy. We still don't really understand it scientifically, but sometimes babies will just unexpectedly pass away in their sleep. So, tragedy after tragedy after tragedy, incident after incident after incident. Finally, 2008 rolls around, and this would bring big changes for LA and for Lamar Odom. With the addition of Pau Gasol, the Lakers quickly elevated from a decent team to a legit title contender. In the playoffs, they dispatched Denver, Utah, San Antonio, ultimately making the finals, and Josh knows how this ends very well, losing to Boston. In the next season, Odom's life becomes increasingly more complicated as he's moved to the bench for the first time since 9th grade. He does not like this. He questions Phil Jackson's ability as a coach. the normally jovial and smiley Odom. He says it's bullcrap, only he doesn't say crap, to a reporter. And then he starts dating a Kardashian. Well, whatever reservations he had, winning has a strange way of making everything okay. Or at least making things seem okay on the surface. Following that season, after losing to Boston in the finals, LA, with Odom principally coming off the bench, has a league best 65 wins. They march through the playoffs, and although his per-game averages dipped from the previous season, he had an offensive rating of 116 versus a defensive rating of just 101. And this is the first of 2 back-to-back titles for the Lakers. And all the while, Odom's celebrity grows. He marries Khloe Kardashian. He's on that Keeping Up with the Kardashian show all the time, and they even get a spin-off that's just Odom and Khloe. He's thrust into an all-new level of national spotlight. As Sports Illustrated would explain, Odom thought he was ready for the reality show and all the tabloid paparazzi mania that comes with it. After all, he was a Laker. He was a New Yorker. He was famous since he was 16. But there is a big difference between sports celebrity and Hollywood celebrity, and he underestimated the gap. After winning the Sixth Man of the Year award in 2011, things quickly spiral out of control. He finds out that he's being traded for Chris Paul, only to have that trade canceled by the league, famously. He took that personally, understandably. He had given 7 good years to Los Angeles, and now they say, oh, just kidding, come on back. His very public marriage starts to deteriorate. Shocker, right? A marriage with a Kardashian deteriorating. After moving to Dallas, he shows up to play for the Mavs out of shape. He publicly and vehemently clashes with Mark Cuban and teammates. He's out of the league 2013 at just age 33. He struggles with drug addiction that nearly takes his life and puts him in a coma in 2015. And given all of the tragedy, losing a mother, having a dad with drug addiction, losing a adopted mother in his grandma, losing a 6-month-old baby, we can almost understand and everything that was going on and why things were so difficult for him. Having the hysteria and the paparazzi of his newfound celebrity life. Everyone thinks they can deal with it. You can't deal with it. No one can deal with that. I'm just here to tell you that. Despite all of the off-the-court hysteria that marked the twilight of his career, and honestly, his entire life, nobody can discount that he was an integral part of the Lakers mini dynasty. And that's why it's just so baffling to me that he was never selected to an All-Star game. Yeah, his stats, well, he wasn't a 25-point guy. He wasn't, leading the NBA and anything. But he was one of the reasons LA was successful. Nobody can discount that he played at an All-Star level, despite never wearing an All-Star jersey. Well, this has been a fun one. Looking back throughout NBA history, some are recent in today's episode. But it just goes to show you how competitive the NBA really is, and some of these amazing, incredible players never get to even make an All-Star game.
Yeah, I mean, we honestly probably could have gone for another 45 minutes to an hour with another 3 or 4 guys. There's some awesome we kind of focus on this recent era, the last 25 years or so, as the league has now expanded to the full 30 plus teams. And as things are now a little more competitive, you do have some real talent that doesn't quite make the All-Star ballot, but are still very good players, whether they're caught in bad situations or they are in good situations but play
sort of a lesser role, but that is still very high impact on a per minute basis. And that's what we saw today. So we might have to run this back in a future episode and do a part 2.
We just may have to do. In the meantime, if you've enjoyed today's episode, do us a favor, like the episode, subscribe on whatever platform you may be listening. Catch us on Twitter at Once Dribble, and share us with your friends. That's how a small podcast and a small YouTube channel like us get to grow. So we thank you for joining us, and this has been a blast.
Yep, and until next time, this is Josh and Calvin signing out.